Parliamentary Debate Championship 2017. We hope that your seats are good so far, and you're enjoying yourself very well. So, let me introduce to all of you for the teams for tonight's final. The first team is intro team. Good luck start. As closing government, TANJAEVUUR. Opening opposition, MARATHEON. And also closing opposition, TAZIM. So I will now pass the floor to the chair of the debate.
Alright, welcome everyone to the grand finals of ABC 2017. Before we start, I'd like to kindly request everyone to keep your phones on silent and minimize discussion on not with the game. Right, let's say, on the motion, this House regrets the legacy of the British in Southeast Asia. I invite the Prime Minister to open this debate. Hear, hear.
Yeah, I'll see that. We live in a world where the legacy of the colonizers are put to test. We live in a world where we can't hold them accountable because we cherish what they have done for us, we cherish the development they brought to us, and the legacy which they bring also makes it seem as if we were far worse off than the point in which they came into power. We reject this wholeheartedly. We would prefer a world where we were shaped in our own identity, shaped in our values in focus and in mind. We think that we had to adopt a lot of systems which we currently have today. We would rather we have chosen and opted into things on our own accord and not something which is given. Right? So there's a few problems in this debate as well. Right? One, we think the British were able to reduce the liability of the lot of atrocious things that they did to us. Simply because they were always want to think that, look, adopting new systems, you always look at it for how you can still participate in a society with all the areas of Southeast Asia, look upwards as a backstanding brought change in an area that revolutionized the world, right? No. We think that the unity for the Southeast Asian countries, preparations for a lot of things to happen, because recognize that the British, as much as they did some good, had a lot of structural problems which they created under their benefits, like things like the divide and conquer, which create racial tensions between society, and ability to get reparations for that does not exist in today's world, right? We also, our identity isn't something we shape on our own, right? There's something that we have to inherit, right? And we have any form of say about it. And the legitimacy of that is something which we regret, right? We'd rather have a world where we decide whether or not we want to have Friday, or we decide whether or not the Sultan should rule, or whether or not the start type of like parliamentary system we have. Even if we opted into it later on, we rather that we have the ability to make these sorts of decisions and not something that we have to inherit, or in the formation of our country, something which we have to set up because we think a lot about alternatives which we want to alternatives, right? What we say is that we regret this, right? We regret that we have to celebrate them in museums, and we'd rather have a world where we have our own way of hosting this. So let's move on to 3 questions, right? How is this legacy tied to the wide damaging? How is Southeast Asia better? I'm asking how we can move further. Before that, closing.
So, can you tell us why after 57 years of have suffered a restricted ability to make choices on our own?
Okay, so this thing to understand one thing, right, is that all the choices which we make, right, is shaped because of the legacy which we currently have. It all started with the legacy which we had a lot from the beginning. We didn't have the opportunity to make this from the beginning. Our legacy where it is, and the fact that we continue to have this legacy is harder for us to get a lot of other benefits and everything. So let's move on. Why do we think that having this legacy? Because recognize that the point at which we have museums that prioritize how piping had the first railroad, how that we have a lot of development that we want into our country, and that how the social economic of society grow and develop. Makes it what it doesn't do, it doesn't stress to the real truth that all of these things British best interest was working whether you take out benefit. The organization system went back to them. Right? The legacy which we essentially prioritized and we cherished so much was never done. The requirements that it needed to help individuals of Southeast Asia, and we rejected them. Right? We believe that Southeast Asia could have been better off on our own. Right? What do we think? Right? We think that there's no good reason for that. We don't have to adopt English as the primary language. Right? That we have our own cultural identity and we shape our life the way we want it to. Right? For example, we don't have to, for example, opt into the legal system of the common law. We had laws of our land before the British came in, right? We had systems which we could have practiced, but we weren't able to do so. And one of the conditions in which we gained independence was that we had to adopt a lot of the system, right? The inability for us to culture easily to this individual. How is this problematic, right? Is that it could also extend to the instances where, because we are unable to identify our own culture, we have to we were forced into a lot of things as a country, right? Sometimes how could have been the countries of their own. A lot of areas which the British country had, were built and were mashed together on their own thoughts, right? It's never to the countries of our own cultural identity. And the point is, right, is that at the point in which we highlight they did a lot of good things for us, we fail to recognize that a lot of these problems were actually stemming to the British, right? We think by eventually, reflecting these forms of legacy, changing the entire society. What we can do is create a better form of discussion tonight, because currently what the discussion is, this problem is not something which was inherently flawed at the beginning. It was a problem that we created on our own. That the racial tensions we currently exist was our own doing, right? The problem here is that there's no form of accountability which is put on the individuals who force us into these situations as a whole, right? Recognize that colonizers will never essentially have to be held accountable at the point in which they can essentially point to the fact that, look, most of these countries adopt systems that we had and we put in place, right? They essentially were far worse off, and therefore all the things which we did was justified. We reject this wholeheartedly, right? Why do we think it is better for us to consider? What is the reparations which can come in, right? We think that we can come together and value around the point at which we need to one, get reparations for the defining point. If you want to get back to the church and stuff, the problem is that a lot of laws, essentially, a lot of the processes in society, is less likely to happen because at the point in which you have this legacy, which is so high, the only part of society which will look at this and say, why do we not do half of this and provide a lot of benefits? The problem here is that it has to be the fact that none of these things that the benefits which was ever done in the messages of person was always done for those individuals. And then the colonizers. And they got they make huge gains. They essentially for themselves. Or we have to live in initiative of which they did it for us. We reject this legacy, we rather push for more popularity, rather push for making our own cultural identity that we need to have, which we have created and had, and then it's help from us, and reject this as a whole. Back to the points.
hello. How to open this one? This one is fine, right?
Test, test, test. Test.
All right. And let's think about that speech that trying to lead us out of the area.
Panel, note that the era of colonization happened in a realm where every single country in that particular standpoint were looking for other countries in order for them to colonize, right? So the colonization of British in Southeast Asia happened within this realm of imperialism. So we must concede that even if Southeast Asia was not colonized by the British, we would have been colonized by the Dutch, the French, and the Spain. It is highly unlikely for you to come up here and give us like a world in which utopia in which you were not colonized. Because even if you want to argue that if we stood on self-determination, then you would have a better future at the end of the day, the government bench entirely never proved to us how that would be comparatively better than to live in a world in which you were colonized by either the French, the Dutch, or the Spanish at the end of the day, right? So a few clarification coming from, we do regret the fact that everything that does not have cut within that endpoint was not perfect and was not great, right? But and we also consider the fact that British did take some of our resources. We must admit, through sober analysis and through analysis, that we stand to benefit from this colonization in the end of the day, which means that not everything entirely is bad to Southeast Asia. So if we can prove to you on opposition bench that the British legacy has at least some things to be proud of, then we will win this debate. Most of my rebuttals will be integrated within my argument, right? So let's first look at what colonialism did to us, because they told us how it stripped us of our self-determination. But let's look within like the reality of it, right? Even though they might say that they regret having British as like the savior of Asia, but we still benefit from all the railroads that they've created. We still benefit from the cities that existed within Southeast Asia and all the types of jobs that we were able to get when the British colonized us, right? We also have things such as like how British foreign investors are able to infiltrate within Southeast Asia because of the fact that we were invaded by the British, right? So comparatively to countries that were not, like countries such as Thailand, and how Thai ports and Thai trading did not get this attention, which means that it enabled Southeast Asia countries that had British legacy, that had British influence to have greater trade in the end of the day. So this greater trade that we have still trickled down to the people on the ground, right? So it's unlikely if we were colonized by the Spain, the Dutch, or the French to be able to get this kind of benefits on our side. So and also comparatively how our world is still better because we were not enslaved in this particular circumstance. There's literally a place called Cape Malay in South Africa which is filled with Dutch Malay slaves, which does not happen in like Southeast Asia where British colonized us, right? So let's also talk about how British made us have the ability for us to ensure that different people are uplifted through the British themselves. Note that Southeast Asia and Asia in general, like how Thailand and Japan are the only exception of the states that remain free, which Japan continued to be an outlier of accelerated growth. So what does it mean? It means that development, infrastructure, and education that happens within Southeast Asian countries that had British legacy enabled people to read law, enabled people to develop their local culture and uplift a family in which they had, right? So this started off with the originality in the form of local laborers to these sort of particular individuals, gave them businesses in which they were able to reap the benefits from. So we believe that in a world in which they were able to get these benefits is perhaps even better than whatever we want to talk about, right? So which also moved to still having locals getting local administration, and also it trickled down to having governors in the end of the day, also political leaders, right? So all of whom create great openness and progressive values as compared to those other nations that did not have British legacy. Right? So without the British, we would not have a Tunku Abdul Rahman in the day. We would not have this kind of political figures to come up to us and tell us that nationalism is, in the end of the day, the most important, right? So we would not have an educated Malaysia in the end of the day. That started off with a highly educated administration and bureaucracy, as well as estates and farms, and all these other mines that started off with the British coming in and telling us that we should do these particular things, right? All of this is because British colonization allowed a British corporation to invest and continue to invest in Southeast Asia, and compared to the colonization that happens in Philippines and Indonesia and Indochina, which we do not see this sort of progress happening within that particular time frame, right? So before I move on to my second argumentation closing.
So the Burmese railroad development in Burma came literally because of an ethnic minority. Can you tell me why that legacy is premise of suffering is something you celebrate?
We believe that in the end of the day, even though that everything that accrued is still under the sufferings of the people, we must look at the context in which if they were not had British in that particular time, perhaps they would have worse off treated, right? Because British, at least they were still charitable in the way that they still listened to the people and gave local administration the sort of treatment that they needed, right? So secondly, why cannot this debate happen in a vacuum in which you just want to say it's self-determination? Why? Because we see other states also colonized, right? So why are the British comparatively better than the French and the Dutch in our world? Because number one, understand that British is an island nation. Perhaps everyone knows that, right? So not a lot of people are in British at a particular point. It means that their capacity to administrate and have better laborers are limited, which means that they have better incentive to train and educate local people in which they had legacy in Southeast Asia, something which rarely happens in French or in the Dutch and the Dutch colonies at that point, right? So we also have how now we have Commonwealth, which trickles down to all of the states in which British had legacy, and also most importantly the usage of English in which people are able to benefit in the end of the day because we had British legacy in the end of the day. So it enabled Malaysia, Brunei, and other states to remain relevant and to remain powerful in Asia. And at the end of the day, this is what we should prioritize, and not because we want to regret a world in which it didn't even happen, right? So without English and without the Latin alphabet, the ability for us to even communicate and to educate ourselves with the rest of the world becomes a distant dream, in which you want to compare the English digits of Malaysia to another country which do not have British legacy in the day, right? So the fact that British legacy made it easier for us to attain investors, learn new technology, and also enable us to follow our framework of government based on the British common law, which they did not tell why they even regret it in the first place. It also has constitutional monarchy, which is comparatively better to other states and to other legal systems that did not enable the people to even get, right? So where else would these incentives even trickle down if not from British legacy itself? The British did not erode our culture like the Philippines. They did not destroy our monarchy like the Dutch and the very lives of Malay identity, and choose to develop us just unlike the French in which they had which is why we believe that the British colony and legacy is comparatively better and the best in Southeast Asia. Never been prouder.
Test. Okay.
All right, let us take a first speech, and I invite the leader, Danny Bradiston.
Ladies and gentlemen, before you is an Indian boy without a home. I'm considered a second-class citizen within Malaysia, and I will not be accepted in India yet. This is an example of the legacy of the British, where many individuals of minority races weren't able to find homes. Now let us engage with emotion before us. When we regret the legacy of the British, this debate does not analyze if colonization was a good or a bad. The debate needs to center around the adaptations of what we've taken from the British's leavings and if that is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. That is why OOs are this debate. But even if they weren't, here are a few lines in the rebuttal. Firstly, they claim that the provision of railroads were exceedingly important to our development. We contest that. Number one, the monies raised from railroads oftentimes only benefited those who are the most rich, firstly. Secondly, only individuals of British heritage. So for every railroad they built, they were able to steal more and more of our tin, and more of our rubber, and more of our important resources to continue leaving us in horrible situations. We don't think that it's proportionate that they left us some crappy, rusty railroad and were able to take so much and give us so little. Secondly, could we have been emancipated without the British? This is the bigger contention of this debate. This need not be the center of the debate. This debate does not take into account if colonization was a good or a bad thing. What this debate needs to really take into account is the structures that Malaysia and Southeast Asian countries have chosen to adopt it and the ramifications of that. But they contest that we could not have been emancipated. Several reasons why we could have and why we would have had some level of development. The rich petroleum that we have in the status quo, and the rich minerals that oftentimes Southeast Asian countries have, and the ability of being surrounded by other developing nations, firstly, is the reason we could have emancipated ourselves. There was no real reason, especially during the Industrial Revolution, and our things could have gone for significantly higher prices, and the money could have trickled down to our own individuals. That would have emancipated us, instead of it being shipped directly to Britain, only to feed those within Oxford. We reject that characterization. Lastly, without the British, we wouldn't have an education system. I think this is the biggest lie the opening opposition tells us. We think Thailand is pretty educated and they weren't colonized and they never chose to adopt any form of legacy of the British. They still maintain the monarchy and we would prefer that way. But why isn't this true, right? Because Asia would have always been the center of development past Europe and past African and American states. Why so? Because oftentimes our geographical proximity separating China and from the European countries was the biggest line of trade that oftentimes were used by many different traders. That means we were a central hub in the area. That is why we were colonized. So we think the sort of transfers that you wished upon, if you studied like Form 1 history, we had a lot of trade and a lot of development prior to the British anyway. The Arab traded with us, China traded with us. Even there's a theory that some Malacca guy, what's his name? Hang Tuah is Chinese, right? So we don't think that is true. But even if, and this is where we will bite the bullet and tell you that even if we weren't educated, we would have preferred that world. And that is why KANDA is very important in this debate. What did KANDA reinstate, right? Firstly, what did KANDA tell you? why the legacy of the British is extremely problematic in the ability for us to continue claiming reparations. Why? Because when you establish a legacy, that means you've chosen to adopt certain systems left behind. That means there's a level of celebration of those systems. When there is a celebration of a system, the British were able to say that we actually developed these nations and we were actually the good guys. We find that horrible. Comparatively, in our world, we would rather remain with our existing systems, not to allow the British to continue domination on us. Why? The lack of the ability of the colonized countries to be able to progress. This is premised on three key things. Firstly, the divide and conquer rule that oftentimes was established by the British. Secondly, the constant oppression of minorities and the shipping in of the minorities. And thirdly, oftentimes the huge levels of workforce that were brought subjected to the, and what did that mean? The reason why a Malay, a Chinese, and an Indian person can never truly be equal is because of these rules, because the constant disparity of wealth inequality that continues to perpetuate. The fact that we were brought up in various different areas under various different cultures, and the British knew that this is the best way forward to ensure that we never collectivize and topple them, was the reason why we don't have complete peace within these nations. We find that horrible. The fact that certain Chinese minorities within Philippines cannot be accepted as first-class citizens within those nations are examples of the legacy of the British that we reject. We would have preferred a world in which we never accepted this. But before I move on to my second argument, I will take closing.
Thailand is an example of that doing pretty well. But the democracy in Thailand is shackled because of blessing majestic laws that allow people to critique their monarchy. Why is that a good thing in your world?
Oh, thank you very much. See, this is where the debates will happen in the back in a comparative. The democracy in Malaysia is not any better. We have traditional laws which are part of the British legacy that continues to stifle opposition and put people behind bars. We have only had one political party in power, no coups whatsoever. The culture of democracy within most Southeast Asian countries are some of the most horrible in the world. Look at Singapore and look at Malaysia, for example. We weren't able to get proper forms of discourse. We weren't able to get proper forms of representation. Sabah and Sarawak continue to be robbed of the resources and never returned. We think Thailand, at the very least, the people on the ground are significantly happier there. And secondly, like there is marginally more benefit around for the average citizen in comparison to countries that were colonized by the British and chose to adopt their legacy. Secondly, and more important discussion, what does it mean to be a country? We tell you that a country is when individuals, number one, were able to fight for self-preservation, but where their identity, cultures, and things that they believe intrinsically were part of the country were able to remain. Was this present when we chose to adopt the legacy of the British? We tell you no. More than the tangible harms that were present in KANDA studies, I think a philosophical discussion needs to happen is what would happen to the Southeast Asian nations if we never chose to adopt the legacy of the British, and would that have led to a better world? Maybe, and this is where I engage with the worst case of the op-bands, that maybe we would have remained uneducated, unprogressive, and not developed significantly. Even in that world, at the very least, number one, we would have the monopoly on how we choose to shape our politics, our country, the languages we use, and how we choose to treat one another in comparison to relying on established and left behind structures by the British. That is a preferable world. But why is that so? Because individuals need a home, and oftentimes the home in which we were able to shape our only true home that we were able to shape it. That is why you would never feel welcome if you walked into a stranger's home or a friend's home. That is the same argument on a macro level. We think when you're able to shape the way in which your country functions without any sort of left behind of colonizing structures, that would have been a preferable world. We regret the legacy of the British and we prefer being Malaysian. Here. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Oh,
Yeah. We don't think that opening government can assert by telling us that the British legacy and the British remnants that they want to talk about is something bad, without them ever proving that it's bad in the first place. Just because it's not yours, just because you've changed it to suit your local cultures, just because you've adapted British common law doesn't mean that British common law is inherently or objectively bad. They have proved us that, and we don't think that's why they're doing this debate. Second, they told us that the British use these railroads to take our resources, take our money, and enrich themselves. True. You can objectively prove how they were able to systematically oppress our people, how they were able to systematically take our resources and calculate that and claim for reparations. You can still have reparations and still admit that there was some good things that happened. It's not mutually exclusive. If that was likely to be true, then no countries that was colonized will ever get reparations in the first place. Third, all this means is the ability for us to remain independent is not necessarily a good thing. They need to tell us what are the incentives for a country which remains independent to accept minorities, to accept people of other faiths, of other cultures. Because what the British did in comparison to countries like Thailand or Indonesia is that the British forced us to accept minorities, forced us to accept that as fellow citizens, as fellow human beings, as compared to Thailand, where you being a Chinese minority means that you are unlikely to enjoy the money levels of benefits in the country. Same thing applies in Indonesia with rampant anti-Chinese discrimination. And then they told us that less redress laws is like better or not as much or not as worse as politics. No. You can at least criticize the government. You can criticize something and not immediately go to prison for it. Thai education is not as good as Malaysian, Singaporean or Brunei education. So we don't think, well, that's going to be true. Third, and this is response to Amit's PY. Like Amit told us about Myanmar, like the British used like horrible things at Myanmar. One, if you want to compare the colonization of British versus the Japanese rule in Myanmar, the Myanmar railroad was much worse under the Japanese. So I think at the very least we can comparatively prove that the British were at least better than the Japanese. Second, the British was able to develop areas like Yangon and make Myanmar a rich country at the moment of independence because they had a level of prosperity that does not exist because small local kingdoms remain, whereby they have no incentives to help the local people, to help local minorities, and to ensure that they can attain a greater level of prosperity for the people. These are things that has no incentive to occur on their side of the house. Thirdly, they told us that these countries, that this debate is not about colonialism, it's about the structures that you admit and accept. Well, you admit and accept these structures because you were colonized. So therefore, this debate is about colonialism. It's about the impacts and the aftermaths of colonialism. So we think we are still in the debate, like, don't trust whatever MITHRUN tells you. But before I move on to my other points, yes, MITHRUN.
True, of course. When we adopt the legacy of the British, they use that as an argument that we actually developed a nation, and that is why we don't have to give you as much reparations as you deserve.
Maybe, but you can still get reparations. You can still claim that your people were oppressed. You can still claim that your people were controlled by them. If you believe what their side is telling you, then it means that African Americans will never be able to get reparations because then the Americans will say, but we brought you to America, we taught you language. These are things that can still happen, they can still get reparations. None of this is exclusive. So why exactly is our first point and second point really important? Because Shah told you two things. That one, that colonialism ensured that we had greater systems and greater ability to enter the world market, to enter greater markets and greater education systems that only the British had comparatively. And second, that if you want to compare the British legacy versus the Spanish, Dutch or French legacy, the British legacy is overall the best one. And this includes you remaining an independent country. Because Thailand does not have strong cultural or heritage-related trade deals. Thailand does not have the ability to enter and make use of the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth trade and the League of Commonwealth education. What this means is that we are able to make use of British systems that they have put in structure, that they have put in support to access the greater benefits of the world. that without the British, you are unable to go to Oxford. That without the British, we are unable to have a level, we are unable to have a parliamentary democracy where you do have a constitutional monarch who is able to have accountability. Without the British, what you do have are lese-majesty laws, and what you do have is discrimination. The ability for you to learn English just in of itself means that you can access the internet, you can access international trade, you can access globalization, which means that you as a Malaysian person, Singaporean, Bruneian, all of this means that you are more likely able to access greater levels of culture, greater levels of education as compared to you remaining Thai or Japanese. What this means is there is some sort of benefit for the British. There is some sort of benefits that we do obtain from the British. This is not an entirely or inherently harmful thing. That you being able to criticize the British versus you admitting that there are certain benefits is not zero sum. You can still do both on our size of house. What does that mean? This means that if they really want to tell you that the British took down our culture and that we were not able to have our own level of self-determination, we tell you you're wrong. They did not force us all to convert to Christianity. They did not force us to take out their last names. They did not enslave us and force us to speak their language to a point where your own local script does not exist, like the Philippines. They do not force us to conform to a single identity, like Indonesia. They did not choose to ignore us and let us live in squalid huts, like in Vietnam. These are all things that the British comparatively give the people of Southeast Asia. This means is that the ability for the British to enter and the ability for the British to stay even then is much, much greater. Because we are able to benefit after independence, the British support structure, the British systems. We managed to contain British companies and British trades in our country. This is something that does not exist in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in the Philippines. What this all means is that the British, in comparison to every other single form of country or independent nation, is the best actor that we have had. That they might not be perfect, but they are damn sure the best we've ever had. What this all means, is the ability for you to enjoy the rights that you have been given, the ability for you to enjoy we can still exist with you admitting that the British did do some horrible things. It's just up to us to attain what that means, what the equality and the level of balance that we want, and then we can get equations. This isn't zero-sum proud tokens.
Can I just go to you? So, hello, can you hear me? Okay. Hello. Hello. Okay. 60 years ago, we claimed we achieved independence. Nothing that exists in Malaysia right now replicates an independent state. We think we've created nationalist identities that have surrounded ourselves around cults of personalities that we still, until today, can't break because they were the liberators of the British. The closing government is going to do a couple of things in this day. Because I think the opening government did a sufficient job in explaining like random examples of why things are harmful. But we will say, systematically, we have created a culture of nationalism that entrenches political parties, both economically and politically, that has significantly harmed the current system in Malaysia. And we think that's how an assessment of the legacy should be. What is the alternative in this debate? Because I think the opening opposition's entire case is premised upon the suggestion that the alternatives are worse. Either it's going to be other colonial masters like the Dutch or the Spanish, or it would have been a lack of colonial master, therefore there's a harm. We have two things to say about this. The first, this debate is an assessment of this particular legacy. If this legacy didn't exist and there was a Dutch empire, there was a Spanish empire, and it caused some harms, we would assess that legacy we can regret it as well. Second, if we didn't have the British rule, here are some reasons why we would not have had alternate rulers. And we're going to give you reasons why. The reason why the British were so persuasive in Malaysia, they didn't use force. They were very specifically able to put residents in Malaysia, in Burma, use political ties that they had exclusively to come to bargaining powers with the colonial masters. These things don't exist with other colonial powers. Like the Spanish, for example, had no interest in the South, in the Malay Peninsula or in Myanmar. They were only interested in Philippines because they were potential Christian converts there. The Dutch Empire, the British Oostcompagnie, the VOC, didn't have an incentive to enter Malaysia because we couldn't use brutal force. We were able to oppose them. For example, Rentap in parts of like Sarawak and Sabah were able to systematically oppose them. So the alternative isn't another colonial master. The alternative would have been our sultanates that currently existed, or would have been a combination of different states. So for example, Johor would have been independent, Selangor, Pahang, and Kelantan would have united. We think this is the alternative. This alternative would have eventually accrued democracy the same way Thailand did. Like Thailand, even though we agree there was a military coup, it's actually one of the most pervasive, like the most peaceful and stable democracy within Southeast Asia. It has had political transitions. It literally ousted a leader that had a cult of personality and removed him from the political system. We say Thailand is a preferable alternative that we will defend. Everything else about railroads and their development and why we need to go to Oxford is absolutely ridiculous because we can prove with systematically harmless alternatives would exist. But I want to suggest one thing. If we didn't have the British colonizing us, they would have still traded with us. They would have still brought Cambridge A-levels here. They brought it to the United States. They weren't best friends. They brought it to China. They didn't love China. Because like eventually you have incentive to globalize independent of what colonial past you have because the British stand to benefit from it. So the benefits of the opening government are not mutually exclusive. We think to colonialism, they haven't given us a reason why. Extension material. First, we think the British Empire, to be quite honest, I'm going to be like realistic here, did unite Malaysia to some degree. Like we all collectively decided we really hated them. Then we had the Suruhanjaya Reed, Suruhanjaya Cobalt, and we formed a coalition of all the sultans and our current founding fathers to take them out. The problem with this was the mentality that we created. Because if you note, and the opening government is right, we were segregated communities. The Indians were mostly in rubber tapping estates, the Malays were in kampongs, and the people who were Chinese were in city centers. This means we created individual mentalities that we were all threatened as a group because of the British Empire. This is harmful for a couple of reasons. First, the moment we removed the British Empire, this created cults of personalities within our Malaysian political system. I'll draw an analogy here, like India, for example. The moment India removed the British Empire and the Raj dynasty came back into place, the first people that they placed their allegiance to was the Indira Gandhi and the Gandhi-Nehru dynasty. This dynasty in India is exactly the same in Malaysia if you look at the trend analysis that I'm going to provide. First, for example, every single time there's an election, the most powerful persuasive tool used by Barisan Nasional, like the current president, is the son of our third prime minister that was involved within the conference that led us to our independence. The reason why there's a creation of a cult personality because they claim we defended our national interests. But did they really defend our national interests? Indians and Chinese would have never come to Malaysia. Can you imagine how much better life would have been in Tanjavur, would have been in Guangzhou? You wouldn't have been needed to come here, been put in rubber estates, being confined to Bumiputra laws that exist, all because of the way nationalism was concepted in Malaysia. Bumiputra laws were created because we told ourselves that we need to protect ourselves against our colonial oppressors. The reason why there's an entitlement in Malaysia in the status quo is because we wanted to fight our colonial masters. Absent those things, even if Indians and Chinese had come to Malaysia, there will be less incentive for us to feel threatened, to base our nationalist identity on this threat. What would it have looked like? First, we would have more political opposition in this country. The fact that certain countries are tied to, certain political parties like Barisan Nasional are tied to nationalism would no longer be the most persuasive political tool that exists right now. That's why they're so infallible. Every time there's a political opposition, they climb down on discourse claiming you're not nationalistic because you're opposing a founding father of our country. If you realize in the status quo, this is the most important way in which we climb down political opposition and why Malay people, for God knows what reason, still support Barisan Nasional. Corruption is high because you create cults of personality that are infallible that you cannot oppose. But the second part of my extension is about the economic restructuring in Malaysia. Look, the suggestion on the opening opposition that we created good ports and good roads is absolutely ridiculous. We restructured the Malaysian Peninsula to be so much worse off for three reasons. First, we invested in some particular economies to the death of others. So we invested in tin and rubber and pineapple in Johor, where we literally siphoned off resources from surrounding states. That's why Pahang is significantly poorer than, for example, Selangor. That's why we invested in particular ports, but parts of Sarawak and Sabah, which, by the way, would have been successful on their own, are robbed of money because the British restructured our economy to be dependent on our capital. And the dependence on our capital is the single most reason why FDI, until today, still entrenches itself in Kuala Lumpur. Doesn't go to Sabah, doesn't go to Sarawak, because we restructure our economy to be dependent on a single individual. But second, this restructuring is actually quite harmful. In an alternate world, where like Malacca is a strategic port, Singapore is a strategic port, we would have had trade and investment anyway. People with the incentive to come, like the Arab traders actually did come, even though the British weren't part of our empire, we would have had a development that would have been more spread out. We wouldn't be more dependent on the capital, and we wouldn't be literally siphoning off resources to make these economies or the industries more dependent. But second, we wouldn't have lost very vital economic structures that indigenous people needed. Like if you look at the Dayak people, they were literally made to convert into Christianity. They weren't allowed to speak their own language. Because of that, they became economic minorities in parts of Sabah and Sarawak. This legacy exists until today. Literally, the reason why we don't have very good cultural artwork, cultural literature in most parts of Malaysia is because we were stifled from a very young age that existed right now. This means you created not only political cults of personality that exist until right now, but second, you've economically restructured the whole country to be dependent on a single particular thing. But thirdly, you have systematically disenfranchised other versions of economies. This is why we think this legacy is harmful. Any alternate world would have been better because we would not have had such a strong subjugation of the community in Malaysia.